let's face it, there's no magic preset or secret amp that's going to get you the bass tone you want. If you don't care why that is, you can go ahead and skip to the full plugin breakdown at the end of the video. But for those of you that do care, we're going to be going over 3 fundamental techniques that you need to understand in order to improve your mixing: dynamics control, saturation staging, and frequency management. We're going to go over intuitive examples of all of these, and make sure you stick around to the end because the last one is the most important. There's 3 tools you can use to accomplish this: compressors, limiters, and clippers. It's important to understand that all of these only react based on the loudest frequency in your signal. So, if the bass frequencies are the loudest in a bass track, how do you ensure that you're getting even compression along your entire signal? You could name any big name and producer in metal and they're probably using this technique. On the left hand side, you can see I've split the bass track into the bass, which is the sub frequencies, and the grit, which is the mid and high frequencies. Doing this allows us to have complete dynamics control over the entire frequency spectrum. If we take a look at the list of all the plugins used in this chain, you can see we've already eliminated a ton of them that only have to do with dynamics processing. But why is it so important that we control our dynamics? You can think of saturators like frequency multipliers. For example, if I input one frequency that crosses a threshold that I set, it will borrow energy from that one frequency to create new frequencies that weren't there in the original signal. If we go back to our list of plugins and we highlight all the plugins that have to do with saturation, you can see there's quite a few of them. Let's talk about why that is. Let's go back to our previous example. If I put in one frequency and we'll say it generated 4 new frequencies for that, I could push that one saturator really hard and really accentuate those 4 new frequencies, or I could use 2 saturators, and now instead of 4 new frequencies, if each of those exceeded the threshold, now I have 16 new frequencies. In reality though, we're not talking about a handful of frequencies, we're generating thousands of frequencies across the spectrum. And this all leads to a much more dense sound. But hold on one second. If the saturators only generate new frequencies based on the input frequencies, how do we control which frequencies exceed that threshold that we sent? This might seem obvious, but it's really helpful to think of EQ as a multi-band frequency volume adjustment tool. With this in mind, we can put an EQ immediately before all of our saturation plugins to decide which frequencies are going to get multiplied the most. So let's look at a practical example of this. You can see here I've placed an EQ on my grit track before any of the saturation takes place. I don't want the muddy frequencies between 100 and 300 Hz to get multiplied through all of my saturators. I never want it to hit that threshold. So if I reduce the volume of those frequencies before the saturator never has the chance to multiply those muddy frequencies throughout my tone. But here's the most important part. This can actually be used as a great tool for mixing. Let's say you have a signal and you place an EQ and a saturator onto that chain. You can max out the drive knob and it will accentuate all of the loudest frequencies in your signal. This makes it so much easier to point out unbalanced frequencies. So with our EQ that we've placed before the saturator, we can reduce the volume of those frequencies until we have a nice even distortion. Now you can roll that distortion back off, or you can remove it and you'll have a much more balanced signal. And this applies to anything, whether that's bass, drums, or guitar. But saturation doesn't just occur on saturators. Remember earlier how I said if frequencies cross a threshold, it will then generate new frequencies? Well, this same effect can happen with limiters. When your signal hits the threshold of a limiter, it has nowhere to go, so it needs to send that extra energy somewhere else, which can often result in harsh, newly generated frequencies. In principle, doing a similar thing as a saturator, but with a much different and often harsher sound. So with all that being said, let's dive into the plugin chains and see if we can make sense of what we have going on here. So what now seems as a very long, daunting list of plugins is going to start making a lot of sense. First, we start off with the gate to eliminate any unwanted noise. We're using THALL amp as an octave pedal here, and we can really only get away with this because of everything that we talked about earlier. For example, we're immediately controlling the DI by pushing it through a limiter. But remember that limiters can also generate harmonics. So immediately after that, we need to cut away all of the harmonics that we don't need or want. We'll do this a few more times, pushing it through limiters to generate harmonics and add control. But it's important that every time after we do that, we then cut away the harmonics that we don't want. We can also add harmonics with plugins like RBass, but we still need to control every time we add harmonics. And then we need to take away the ones that we don't want. So why am I constantly adding and taking away? While it might be true that most of the harmonics that we've generated live in these higher frequencies, we don't want that or need it for this track. So we can safely just get rid of them. And we still retain all of the added harmonics that we've generated within the sub bass range. Finally, we want to hit it with one extra limiter to make sure our dynamic range is completely dialed in and we limit how many harmonics we generate. In the grit track, you can see a very similar workflow. We have a gate and an expander to eliminate unwanted noise, clipper to control dynamics and add harmonics. Here's the EQ we talked about earlier, eliminating unwanted frequencies before saturation. More control, more harmonic generation. We'll add the octave shift here, which is totally optional. It's just something I like for my songs. A little bit more frequency adjustment before we hit our main saturation stage, which in this case is Amp Room Vildsint by Softtube. Next we have a more traditional EQ, which is correcting for the cabinet in Amp Room. We'll then run it into Dark Glass, which has the distortion off, so we're only adding compression and some EQ moves here. Some more traditional EQ to tame the cab, and then we're back to our usual stage of adding control, generating harmonics, cutting away the ones we don't need, one final saturator in specific areas to make sure the bass stands out in the mix, and then again we'll do it 3 more times, making sure it is controlled and we're adding harmonics and taking them away when we need to. It's worth noting when we combine these 2 tracks together, we're going to have buildups where the frequencies overlap. To compensate for this, we can add a multi-band compressor, especially focusing in the range where these 2 tracks overlap. Finally, we can get rid of all the frequencies that aren't contributing anything to the mix, and then we'll hit it just a little bit with one final limiter to make sure all the dynamics are controlled and no extra harmonics are generated. Once you understand and implement this workflow, it will unlock a world of opportunity for you. So if you stuck with me all the way to the end, try these techniques out on your own mix and let me know down in the comments if it helped you out. That's going to be it for me today, guys. I'll see you in the next one.